Agenda updated just automatically. Agenda to go.
I think you have to, all you have to go grab the, you have to sit. Well, you can do it after. And I just. We're live. We're live.
Okay.
It just.
Welcome to the Provo.
Provo enjoying their park recreation facilities, out on trails, enjoying the playgrounds, the splash pad, all the athletic fields that we have, and all the teams that we're able to host here in town, and just seeing people enjoy all of the facilities that are here and how it makes
create a conflict, it does create a great deal of ambiguity, because now, theoretically, in order to know where you can sell, you've got to go check the map to find out what the legal boundaries of the park are, right? Whereas if you leave it in, you just go ask the parks director, and that answers your question.
And then the definition of adjacent, is it adjacent to the right-of-way? Is it adjacent to the edge of the park property? What is it adjacent to?
Well, that's not defined in the, current. I mean,
I think a reasonable, if you use the word adjacent, I think a reasonable interpretation of what would be used is the right of way adjacent to the park property would be prohibited.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just a little concerned about making these things user-friendly for our residents. What is best practice where you've got two different ordinances that affect something that's going on? Doesn't it make sense to include all the information in one ordinance rather than make it, the ordinance doesn't say anything about it? Somebody looks at that and they think, okay, I know now what I need to do, and yet there's another ordinance that deals with it. Wouldn't it at least be well to say everything that you do must be in accordance with such and such other ordinance? Please refer to that in addition to this, or I don't know how that works.
Certainly. So, you know, and that's why I say leaving it in creates some clarity, because it tells you where you have to go to get permission. If you were going to take it out, then there's an argument to be made that even if you're taking this out, you should still insert a provision that says that refers to the ban on sales within the parks, so that they know they have to go look at that.
I had a question for you and for Roger. I think one of the concerns originally was that it might be somewhat onerous to get approval from the park director because he's really busy, and that does this language allow for the park director to delegate the decision to assistants and staff members? So that,
yes, it specifically says or his or her designee.
Oh, okay, forgot that. Thank you.
That was something that they mentioned, that Christian mentioned, that it might be onerous to get, you know, first permission from the city, or to have to go for an extra, you know, you get a permit to have a special event in the park or rent a pavilion or what. I guess that's all parks though. If you're renting the pavilion and you're getting the food trucks, that would be all be taken care of in the same director.
And I would hope that if someone's, I don't know how our process works, but I'd hope that if someone is seeking a special event permit from the zoning special event coordinator, and the special event is next to a park, they're going to confer with Roger before granting them.
Yeah, anytime there's a special event in a park, parks, and sometimes it's Roger and sometimes it's somebody delegates, but is in that chain that has to go through the approval process before I actually grant the special event permit. And we do that routinely several dozens of times a year for sure.
And all the time I've been the director of the department, I would think the requests that have come in, I think I've gotten decisions very quickly, whether it's an acceptance or denial. And so I don't really think a time frame is really much of a problem. But I really feel like there needs to be some checks and balances somewhere just to make sure that we're being consistent with at least what's already in the ordinance.
So I had a question then. Does the language that's in the other ordinance resolve your concerns? That they still have to have permission to sell something in the park, or would you rather have it explicitly in the?
Well, we kind of thought that this language reflected exactly what was in the existing code already. So if it was not spelled out again here and just referred to the other code, I'm certainly fine with that.
Because the other code says they have to come to you.
Yeah, it basically says the same thing that this does here.
That's good.
But just, you know, I'll support whatever you decide to do, and we'll try to make it happen. I'm just trying to bring the points out of things that I've noticed as concerns, and what potentially could be concerns, but how this could be more consistent with what's already been there for the last 21 years that doesn't seem to have really been a problem.
Right, and the only concern that people have had that requires them to take it out of it suggested is because it's unnecessary regulation. That's what they're saying. It's just duplicate or what?
Well, I think the interpretation, if you took it out, would be that they can park adjacent to a park. They could put their food truck adjacent to a park.
Even though
so the other,
they can't.
Well, so
the other ordinance says within the park. It doesn't say adjacent to a park. And so the argument could be made that if you're adjacent to the park, you're not in the park.
So they do say different things, that they're not just saying the same thing.
Yes.
Like for example, if you look at Pioneer Park, just right over here at Center Street 500 West, here's a park that has parking around the park. And we always looked at if somebody's coming like to the splash pad or something, they park in the parking lot, but that's really technically part of the park, because they're parking there to go into the park. So if the food truck kind of pulled up into that space and took about 6 or 7 parking stalls, to me, they're within the park.
And I agree with that. I mean, that clearly I think is private property at that point, because we're not in the public right of way anymore, we're inside the parking lot. I think this is more concerned about parking on the street.
And yet there's definitely other parks where the parking is within the park. It's not on the periphery of the park. So every park is not consistent.
Roger, just where's the parking you referred to for the parking? For the splash pad.
So where is the parking?
On street, well, it's on street.
So you're saying the street then becomes the parking lot for the splash pad?
And they're definitely,
Yeah.
Okay, but that's not,
it's not spelled out.
How many already got in the ordinance they can only park where it's
Legally.
Only park where you can park parallel. And
Yeah.
then to the
Does that-
sidewalk. And so around on those
That
two
whole
sides
park,
where you have the diagonal parking.
they can't park there
Street
anyway.
Right.
Yeah, so
Right.
from Pioneer Park's perspective, yeah, and then both Center Street and Fifth West are speeds in excess of 35 miles an hour.
And they're not in excess.
They're at, I guess they're at.
They're at, and so that's a
Yeah.
issue.
So that could be an issue.
And they can't park across the street because that's residential, right?
Right.
So a food truck, I mean, we
So
just
Pioneer-
use that example.
Yeah.
Pioneer Park, they couldn't
doesn't-
park there anyway unless they got permission from Albertsons across the street to park in there.
Yeah.
Or over across the street in city's parking lot.
Yeah.
I mean, so,
I mean, they gotta be legally parked in a parallel spot. So that's the standard for being on the street.
So why couldn't they park in parallel park on the west side of Pioneer Park? Why couldn't they legally park there?
On the west side of Pioneer Park,
Uh-huh.
it's diagonal parking.
it's diagonal.
Oh, it's diagonal there. Okay, and then on the south side?
South side is
It's all
diagonal.
diagonal over
Right.
there.
The other sides, there's no
Okay.
legal parking. There's no on-street parking on Center Street or States or Fifth West. So those are prohibited parking zones. They can park there anyway. So Pioneer Park isn't an issue, but again, there's 38 other parks.
Yeah.
We have to ask the question.
And each one will have a different situation.
So any other questions
Shall we continue
at
on?
this point? And I have a question of Brian. So
Yes.
there have been a couple of different issues brought up with this. If we were to have a motion to, to adjust those things, should we do it all at once? Should we do it if there were a motion entertained?
It's probably going to be best to do those one at a time, I would guess, because I think that'll make it easier. I've got depending on how you feel as we go through this, I have one of the versions that was sent to you this morning is what I call the clean version. And the clean version addresses probably 90% of the issues, but there are 4 specific questions regard to the clean version, and this is one of them that I think we probably actually need a specific decision made on before we go forward to prepare a final ordinance.
Okay. And
Was
I
it
can't
clean?
Open up that school.
But the clean version-
Is there a PDF you could send? I couldn't open up that.
Okay, I'll try that.
The clean version has the parks part taken out
Well, it's actually,
with the question
yeah, it's actually still in there, but in strike-through
and strike through.
fonts.
You're right.
Oh, I did see that part.
And so,
It's in there with strike through font with.
so
I don't know if that's
you can either address, the 4 questions I have as we go through, or Ryan can wrap up the summary and I can come back and ask you each of my 4 questions. However you'd like to proceed there.
I'm sorry, one more time.
I said, so we can either address the 4 questions I have as we go through, one by one, or Ryan can wrap up his summary and I can come back and ask you those. And you can comment on any other disagreements you may have with the clean version.
Okay, let's have Ryan
Okay.
continue, and then we'll have you
Okay.
address the board.
So next part that we deleted section 6, 320402. and subsection B and C. And the reason they thought it was just overkill for what was required of the applicant. They did also add a requirement to show proof of a safety inspection for the vehicle. And the legal concerns about this change, there weren't any. So I'll just go through unless you stop me for further questions. Criminal background check. The only change that the business group made was to take out that all employees had to have the criminal background check, that it was only the driver and the owner. And the legal concerns about that change were none. There were some other legal concerns, but I kind of have those at the end, and Brian can talk about those with some other sections of the background check. Fire inspection requirements. One of the things that Christian brought up was there have been some problems with some food trucks that have been in operation, and then the fire inspection's done, and they're required to do more things than they thought they would have to, and it costs a lot of money. They had to go back. And, it was a very expensive process. So they asked that the requirements for the fire inspection would be included in the ordinance. And so I contacted them, and they sent the requirements that they have for the fire inspection. So we've added those to the ordinance. Legal concerns, there weren't any with that one. Food trucks on private property, 632.070. Hold on up here. And that had to do with the example that was given was egg rolling. It's where food trucks on private property have almost become permanent uses. And I don't think it was a strong argument either way. I don't think there were strong feelings either way. But there was some thought that maybe we should change the ordinance to make it so that something like egg rolling, where they're on private property, can be there for longer. They have different restrictions. The way we put it in the ordinance is that all business activity related to mobile food business in the public right of way shall be of a temporary nature. So it's the part where it talks about being temporary, and we included the language that says in a public right of way. The legal concerns, there are actually quite a few. The fact that those may become permanent uses over time. Zoning enforcement becomes difficult. Discrimination becomes difficult. And I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Brian.
Well, I'll just say, kind of in summary, if you didn't have a chance to read the comments that I inserted there, that I don't think we have, I or any other members of the legal staff that worked on this, I don't think we have any problem with the degree of temporariness being different on private property than it is in the public right of way. But we feel like it's absolutely essential that there is a temporariness requirement. That even on property, it has to be that they can't become a permanent use. So, maybe they're only required to move once a week instead of
3 days.
Instead of every 3 days. And whatever that policy decision is about how long that should be, we don't really care. But we feel that it's absolutely essential that there is some requirement that they have to move enough to make sure that that use stays temporary. And I can go into that more if there's questions, but otherwise.
Any other questions?
Just regarding that issue, with the food vendor, what was their argument to not have the same rule as they did on the public right away? In other words, 3 days and once a week?
Just the fact that it was public, that it was private property, and that the business owner or the property owner should be able to decide. That was the argument. There, as we looked at different cities' ordinances, this also is something that varies from city to city. Some cities have the exact same requirements if you're on public-private property or public property, and some have different requirements.
And some have.
I just think it's that temporary definition that the argument is we don't want to be temporary, we want to be permanent, and so we want that.
Right, and I think that becomes very problematic. And some of the cities, some of them you have to move as often as every 2 hours.
Yep.
Other ones Austin, was it Austin? I think it was Austin, that they don't require you to move every 2 hours, but if you stay for longer than 2 hours, you have to provide a written agreement that shows you either have bathroom facilities or have an agreement with an adjacent property owner that they will provide bathroom facilities. So,
What is the definition of moving? Because I know that sometimes when you're parking on the street, if I move and change to another parking right up the, one vacant spot in front of me, I have moved my vehicle.
right.
So what is the definition of moving in a private area?
We haven't defined that, and again, that the intent is simply to prevent them from establishing a permanent location, so.
Well, and they also has, this is on public property, but it's all vehicles must be removed from public right of way at the close of each business day. So again, they can't stay there
The way it's
overnight.
listed here, but if we
But again,
change that
that's just
requirement for
public.
private property,
I think the way we would interpret it, off the top of my head, I think the way we would interpret it is that you've got to move from a piece of property that's owned by one owner to a piece of property owned by a different owner. Or at least, well, no, it could be the same owner, I guess, but that you're not still on the same parcel of property, right? Because otherwise you're tending to create a permanent use on that parcel. So you've got to move from the beef jerky piece of property, down the street until it's a different parcel. That'd be how I would interpret it without any further definition.
are you comfortable with interpreting that for everybody that comes to you and say that's what we have to do? Okay.
All right, we'll continue. Public events. So there's a couple changes to the 632-080 use of public right-of-way. Section 4, and I'll just read it here. Originally it said the operator shall operate the vending window facing the sidewalk or on private property. And then what the business group added was, unless the roadway has been closed to vehicular traffic for a public event.
Perfect.
So that's kind of self-explanatory there. And then they added the requirement where they can't be on a street that exceeds 35 miles per hour. They added unless the roadway has been closed to vehicular traffic for a public event. So again, just adding those exceptions in there. Legal concerns, none on that part. Here's a part where one word was changed and caused a little contention there. In section 632-0809, what it says is no use of power or water located on the private property is allowed without written consent from the owner. And what the group came up with was striking the word written, so allowing it to be verbal consent. The legal department came back with some pretty strong concerns about that. First of all, enforcement issues. It makes it very difficult. And the biggest thing was to protect against liability. It protects both parties from suits. I don't know if you want to go into that any further.
Well, so one of the attorneys pointed out or shared anecdotally, and this doesn't have anything to do with food trucks, but about a lawn care business that they pulled their truck up to his neighbor's, hooked into the fire hydrant without putting a water meter on, filled their tank, did their stuff, unhooked, and drove off with an empty tank. And the problem is, in that case, obviously it's a city fire hydrant. It's easy to catch. The concern from an enforcement standpoint is a lot of the businesses that you might end up getting, that you might come up and hook up to. And my understanding from Christian's response is that this isn't something that they would do very often anyway. That it's not something that would be.
They don't need that regularly.
Right. But the concern is a lot of the business owners or property owners where a food truck would hook in may not be local. So if a police officer comes up and says, do you have consent to be using this power or water? And the truck driver says yes, and it's a week later before the police officer can verify it, and the truck driver's not there. But if you require the written consent, then it makes enforcement much easier. It's not not something, this isn't one where, if you disagreed, it's not something that kills the whole thing, but it makes enforcement much harder, and it makes, in our view, it much more likely that there could be disputes over whether there was permission or what the scope of the permission was, in a way that nobody can ever satisfactorily find out the answer to that. So we'd strongly encourage leaving that in.
Like, does that say, you said owner, Ryan? Does the ordinance say owner, written consent from owner?
It
say
says,
See,
yep, from
see
the
that
owner.
being kind of problematic too.
And we certainly
Does that
Yeah,
mean who's on the
from the
title
owner.
of the property, and if they live in California and somebody.
certainly it'd probably be no problem to put or the owner's designee into the
Yeah,
ordinance.
there you go.
Be the property manager who can give an okay.
Right.
That's a good point. Okay, we'll move on. Food trucks next to each other. The business group, particularly Christian, had a real strong opposition to this provision. The provision which does not allow two food trucks on the same, the way it says it is on the same side of the street within the same block face of another mobile food vendor. His argument is mobile food vendors thrive on being next to each other. That helps business, that helps bring people in. And so he wanted that removed. Legal concerns, there are none. The working group, the administrative working group that came up with that language originally apparently had a lot of discussion about that. I guess it wasn't consensus, but some people did have strong feelings that that should stay in there. But we struck it out according to the business group's recommendations. So I don't know if you have any questions.
Can you tell me why they wanted it in there? Is it just to limit the number of trucks? Just say we don't want this business.
I think this is for, they cited for safety reasons.
For safety.
The more trucks, the harder it is to cross the road, different things like that.
Trucks being there eliminates parking, and the more parking you eliminate, then the more pedestrian traffic you have, because people have to walk farther to get there. And so it's all situation specific, but the concern raised by the group was a congestion issue, and safety concerns arising out of the congestion issue.
Yeah. Distance from restaurants. So this was one. The working group actually went back to the ordinance and changed it to a radius. That's something we discussed a little bit last time, or the original time we talked about it too. And the business group agreed that 100-foot radius seemed appropriate. The only thing that they changed was that it would be from any public entrance to a restaurant. Because if it was to the main entrance, the businesses were concerned that you could go around the corner where there may be two entrances to a building, and then you have the food truck right in front of one of those entrances. So essentially, it's 100-foot radius from any public entrance to that building. There are no legal concerns on that one. So that was all of the recommendations from the business group. I'll turn the time over now to Brian to talk about some of the other legal concerns that he had, and then the questions as well.
Okay, so I went through, those of you who had a chance to look at the markup version sent out today of the, again, just so we're clear, what I did is I took the version that was sent out on Thursday, and I accepted all the changes, except for, with the minor exception of there were a couple places where, in order to highlight that something had been deleted, I left it in, but it was in strike through, so you could see that it was intended for deletion according to the Thursday version. And then I marked that up pretty extensively. Now, probably 80% of those changes were cleanup or moving some things to a different paragraph where I thought it made better sense, or changing every reference to food trucks to mobile food business so that the same term was being used. But I'll just go through quickly and highlight a couple of other changes as I go through and ask my 4 questions. So the first one, I call this mainly to the attention of the administration in case they want to curse me for this. In the definition section, I actually changed the definition of mobile food business. And my concern here was, the comment I made in the draft was that I think the definition we had was aspirational rather than definitional. And what I meant by that is it talked about the business being readily movable. And the idea is we want it to be readily movable, but I don't want someone raising an argument that because it's not, it doesn't actually fall under the ordinance. And the reason why I came up with that again is because when I went to this training in Austin, they have this frequent problem with the people. They pull their truck up, and then they come in and they nail steps to the front of the truck, and they throw some potted plants around, and they put out a shade awning that's 10 feet wide, and all of a sudden you can't move it anymore. Okay, and so the idea behind the change was let's not let somebody use that as an argument for saying they're not actually covered by the ordinance. So the one thing I wanted to call your attention to is the only thing that's covered in the ordinance right now, according to my change, is motorized vehicles and trailers. So if there's something I'm missing, I actually spent probably an hour and we're looking at ordinances all over the country to try to see if there was a common definition, and every one of them was completely different. And the problem was they range from a lot of them include push carts and hand carts and ice cream vendors and bicycles, and so a lot of them just refer to wheeled vehicles of any kind or vehicles capable of locomotion. That didn't seem to be the intent here, so I changed the definition to be motorized vehicles and trailers. If anyone thinks there needs to be something more than that, then we need to know that.
Well, some of the comments that I've gotten have been from owners of shaved ice places. I think they consider themselves mobile businesses, even though they're not picking them up and moving them around.
Well, and actually, that was part of the reason why I changed the definition, because I don't think that they are under the intent of the ordinance, because they're specifically covered under the temporary use section of the zoning code, and so that was actually part of my intent, was to make sure that they weren't included in the definition, because I think they're not supposed to be. So
Kind of treat those as temporary or seasonal businesses, so they have a specific time period. I think it's April 1 to. I mean, there's a time period specified. They also don't typically move.
Yeah, we don't want them
they
to move
stay
more than
there
3 days.
during the season.
They have to have building inspections.
Yeah, they do. They get an electric drop, for example, and so they've got building code requirements for temporary business. So I think they're a different animal.
So I just throw that out there as a potentially significant change. Now, which brings me to the first question.
Mr. Jones,
Yes.
so how are they then, if they have a kind of food truck park right next to them, and they're not included in this ordinance at all?
Correct, they're not included at all. So yes, if there was a legal parallel parking space in a zone right next to a shave ice place, they could park. A mobile food business could come up and operate.
That was the concern.
Yeah, the ones that I think they wrote to you as well,
Mhm.
were concerned about that a food truck could come and park right next to you. In fact, they wanted to be considered in that protected category. One
Yes,
thing
unless
that
the-
didn't just refer to the downtown businesses, but
What is the 100-foot thing that's over there? Does it say restaurant?
100
Yeah.
plus
The
maybe.
100-foot one?
A restaurant or city authorized special events selling food.
You could
I mean,
add
you could-
special or temporary use.
You could add temporary uses that involve the sale of food to the 100-foot radius prohibition.
But then she did mention that there's a like a taco truck that actually helps her business when they're closed, and so then is that something that she would have to give permission? Does she have permission to give to have them be closed? Those are the questions that come to play with that type of
yeah, so it's like a
Set up.
taco truck that pulls up and says, when you buy 3 tacos, here's a coupon for shave ice. They're on the corner.
Mm-hmm. So
It's up to you.
We got the parks director giving permission, we got a neighborhood chair permission, now we got the taco lady giving permission.
it's the shave ice. But I don't know if she owns. Do they have to own the property to have their, or to have permission from the property owner to have their
No,
shave ice thing there?
Well, yes, in order to have the shave ice thing there,
So they'd have to have permission from the property owner, but they're not necessarily the property owner.
So the shave
they-
ice operator has to have permission from the property owner to have the shack there.
Right.
Okay? And
So then
then,
who offers permission for
and then if you have the
them to
truck,
be on private?
now the truck's in the, well, okay, if the truck is on private property, it's coming from the property owner. And if it's in the public right of way, there isn't a permission. If you add one to the 100-foot radius, then the 100-foot radius permission is from the owner or operator of the competing business,
Mhm.
right? So that would come from, on both private property and public property, that would come from the shave ice operator. All of this reminds me of the articles I sent to Matt earlier in the week. Actually, 2 articles in The Economist last week arguing for creation of economic, main economic driver is deregulation. Both of them mentioned food truck businesses as prime examples of how to do that. So they were promoting cities that have allowed food trucks with little regulation.
Mhm.
So I think this kind of cage point is, you've got to resist the urge to fix everything with this ordinance. Because if you do, you can put out of business.
And the one thing I'll comment on, because this was kind of raised last week, is whatever decision you make today doesn't have to be the decision forever. So if you make a decision today to pass it without protecting shave ice stands, and you start getting complaints that shave ice stands are going out of business, you can come add that back in. If you protect the shave ice stands today and get complaints from the food truck businesses that it's putting them out of business and it wouldn't hurt the shave ice businesses, and you change your mind, you can always take it back out.
I guess the hard thing too is, if we have a shave ice business, there's a macaroni and cheese truck parked out in front of there. Does that put them out of business? Or are we going to define it so well that we're going to say, okay, if it's a shaved ice business, then they can only just allow a shaved ice mobile truck from being within 100 feet? I mean, I just think we get.
They're also,
They're not even competing industries, really.
a lot of things that the restaurants say the reason they need protection for the shaved ice don't have the high brick and mortar overhead costs.
Exactly. And if someone's looking for shaved ice, they're not going to go. It's a macaroni and cheese truck. I don't. Now, if there's a shaved ice mobile truck that pulls up right in front, then I'd say, okay, that caused some grief. But
And that was the concern.
That's what she said,
Shave
that
ice
there
people
was.
said they're thinking about maybe doing a shave ice truck. So they didn't want us to be too tough on the mobile truck.
I'll come back to one of the points Christian made a couple weeks ago, and that was 50 members of the voters. So why are you favoring the shaved ice pad over the shaved ice in a food truck? And why shouldn't, if it's a good location, who gets to say market should just, let the market dictate.
best shaved ice
The prices.
product's going to attract the people. I mean.
So, and as a procedural matter, let me make one comment so that we're all on the same page. And this probably reflects some arrogance on my part, but I'm assuming that the changes I made are the right changes. So my assumption is that the version we bring tonight will be what I've called the clean version, other than the answers to the 4 questions I'm going to ask you, unless you tell me otherwise. So if there's something like shave ice protection that you want to add to this, there needs to be a motion to tell me to add it to this so that I know that that's the direction the council wants to go. Did you have another question or comment? Okay, so the first question that I just want some guidance on, and this doesn't necessarily need a motion as much as if I can clearly gather the intent of the council without a motion, that's fine. But the very first one, and maybe the big one, is because of the procedure through which this came to you, which was taking the old ordinance, dumping it off to the business group, having them reach what they thought was an equitable agreement, and then bring it back to the council. I want to make sure that the council agrees with some of the things that they did. So my very first question is, does the council want the prohibition district in the ordinance?
Comments?
So you're speaking there of the outline in the downtown.
Right, the downtown prohibition district.
I feel comfortable with it if the 2 groups felt comfortable with it.
And I feel comfortable, but why are we 100 feet radius? What is the purpose of that? Is it really necessary? Because Center Street, no parking anyway.
Well, and if you're going to do it, based on my concerns about stating a reason for doing it, if you're going to do it, I think Mike probably defined the best reason I've heard so far, which is defining it so that it's easier to understand where you can and can't go. So that in the downtown district you don't have to go measure 100 feet or figure out whether you can park. You just know that inside that district you can't without having to go measure the 100 feet. So far I think that's the best reason I've heard for the council to go on record for including it if you want to include it.
That makes sense to me.
Mr. Sewell?
For truck vendors thinking that there will be some occasions when they'll be invited there.
Apparently, and that's why they've got the exception written in here for the special event invitations.
Mr.
Like a
Sewell?
rooftop concert, then,
Right.
Yeah.
they're invited.
Sorry.
And also, we bring them there.
Hold your comment for just a minute.
Covey Center for the Arts.
Was that?
It's okay.
Okay. Right. Mr. Sewell?
I just want to say I'm really impressed that we have these two groups with competing interests that we're able to have this dialogue and come up with something they could bring to us that they'd agreed on. And I guess I feel similarly to Mr. Hales. If they're comfortable with it, I'm comfortable with that, and agree with the reason that has been stated for it.
So,
Are there any concerns or reservations about having the zone? Any council members? Mr. Van Buren?
I just hate the term, the
Prohibition.
prohibition.
Oh yeah, maybe we can come up with a better word.
That's my fault.
That makes,
Blame me.
that makes food trucks evil to me, you know, I mean, it's like, they're pro. But if they both agree to it, I'm not gonna be one that's gonna.
Well, that's a good point. We should call it something else.
Yeah.
They didn't necessarily agree.
They didn't agree on that. That was just something.
No.
That was just something.
It was originally called the downtown something zone.
Food truck zone.
But the problem with the terminology of zone in my mind is the confusion with zoning ordinances, which is this is not. And
is restriction better than prohibition? Food truck restriction?
yeah, restriction area
Restriction
or.
Restriction district.
But the intent of the prohibition district was just differentiate from the term zone, which is a different mechanism, I think.
I like restriction.
Restriction area?
Food truck
Does that make
restricted.
you feel any better, Kay?
Not much, but.
A tiny bit. Well, we'll take what we can get. Okay. I'll make that change. Restriction, food truck restriction area. So that brings up I guess a sub-question, which is in my draft, I deleted, because of the concerns raised earlier, the exemption that's allowed to be granted by the neighborhood chair. So based on the conversation before, does anyone have concerns with that? And if so, what's your recommended solution?
Mr. Sewell?
Well, I'd like to ask the administration how they feel about that. It sounds like the Food Truck Association wanted to have some mechanism in there. So should we go with what we were talking about earlier with the mayor or his designee, which would often be Mike?
My personal feeling, again, you know, other minds may differ on this, and I wasn't part of that conversation, so maybe I don't fully understand their concerns. My personal take on it is that I think they have that mechanism through the ability to go to the administration and ask for a special event. Because, again, special event is not defined, so if special event is the weekend that we want to have food trucks in the downtown, then they can come say to the administration, our special event is a weekend we want to have food trucks in the downtown, and they can, but that's just my
special event permit is quite cumbersome. It can be quite cumbersome.
Okay.
You got police looking at it, you got fire looking at it. Does that make sense versus?
Yeah.
So with the noise ordinance variation right now, just contacting the office, we can get one out in a couple hours. So that would be the one.
Okay.
Part of me likes that a lot because that means I don't, you know, it's all taken care of before I see it.
Right.
Which is nice, but it isn't more, it would be difficult on a Friday morning to say, well, can we do this Saturday night?
So the feeling that would be the mayor's office that grants the a waiver, or
It's,
or where would it go?
I'm not promoting that, but it is a fast, viable option that can move something through rather quickly. But the reason I'm hedging is if I'm doing one of these every weekend.
And typically, the way we draft those kind of, as I think about it, typically the way we draft those kind of exemptions is it says the mayor or his or her designee. So the mayor could potentially designate licensing to take care of whatever customer service.
Right.
Right.
Would there also be a time?
Is that comfortable for you?
I'd rather be a city employee than that, I think. But I have a problem with consultation.
Can it be, can there be something about the time has to be submitted 5 days in advance, 3 days in advance, so that they don't have it coming?
Yeah,
Yeah, but what I'm trying to avoid is part of the beauty of the food truck is the spontaneity of it. Put together an event.
But you would prefer to have some, because they will call you on Friday morning when you're not even here.
Yes. But I'm stuck between wanting to be accommodating and helpful and knowing if it's the wrong thing or they go along with us.
And without putting it in the ordinance, I mean, the default logistics is that if they submit it when there's nobody here, it's not going to get approved in time, so too bad for them.
And one way to look at this is you could adopt that as a temporary, again, this is not a permanent thing, this is maybe a temporary provision with the intent of the council or an intent to ask for the mayor to bring back parameters to say you can just get an over-the-counter permit from customer service if X, Y, and Z is satisfied. You know, maybe you need a little more time to figure out what X, Y, Z is, but.
Or if it's the same thing every weekend, we're going to come back to you and say, you got to fix this in the ordinance.
I think the problem with, sorry, Dave, the problem with having customer service to it is they're going to look at a list of things. Did you do X, Y, and Z? And I think our comfort level with having the mayor do it is he's been part of this conversation and sort of understands what we're trying to avoid and what we're trying to accomplish. So I'm uncomfortable having customer service do it, but I would feel more comfortable having somebody who's been part of the discussion do it if it's administration. I wouldn't mind. I think I'm most comfortable with having the mayor's office do it and reporting back, for example, in a year and telling us whether it's been working or not. We need to adjust it.
Mr. Sewell.
I would support that also. I think it sticks a little closer to the intent of the original agreement, and I think Mike's going to get involved in this one way or another, and I kind of like the way that was described.
First phone calls.
Yeah, so I want to make sure they can have the event if they feel like it's going to be helpful to the downtown. I mean, bring the trucks.
You want to require by ordinance that the consultation with neighborhood chair occur, or
No.
leave it
I suggest maybe just a see in consultation. Or I think just suggest.
I would.
You can- they say may-
Put me in charge of it, don't bind
may
me by
consult.
that because
Yeah.
I can't reach Mike.
Makes sense.
Does that make sense?
So if you want to provide guidance, you could use the word may consult with the neighborhood chair.
Okay, question number 2. Do you or do you not want to delete the paragraph about the adjacent to the parks?
Can I throw in a comment that may help that? Roger and I have a little sidebar. And I think that one of the things that we could do administratively is actually get on the website and designate pre-approved parks. And have that right there on the website. So, and we could start small with Roger picking several around the city that would say, look, these are already, as a director, I'm pre-approving this. Have it right on the website, food trucks, and show them where they can park. And then you can expand that as it's working well, or come back on that. And that may give some of the flexibility that I think some of you were looking for, being able to go fast in the park.
We use that, a similar provision to that in designating smoking areas in public parks. There are some parks where we allow smoking, and that's reviewed every year. The Parks and Recreation Director is required by ordinance to notify the mayor about which parks smoking is prohibited in, which parks it's allowed. So we sort of have a process by which we go through and do these analyses every year and clean up and make changes where necessary. And so maybe, again, it's a similar process. Maybe find some of the same language, it just, requires the director to make those provisions, notify the mayor.
When Christian mentioned this, he said that parks weren't really their big, money-making places anyway.
Yeah.
It's more the events at the parks that they, like the Rock Canyon event that they were invited to by Parks and Recreation. So he didn't feel like, parks were a great venue for food trucks day to day, but if there was an event, that was something
I
that
think
they.
one of the things we were targeting is, I want to have a birthday party, I want one of the food trucks there. I can do it at this park.
Unless it's not the month that it's designated, or how often do you designate?
I think what we're thinking is just have some parks permanently, those Roger look over his inventory and say, look, I'm always okay with it right here. Getting it on the website, just like you can reserve a pavilion, you can see, oh yes, I could have a pavilion, and it accommodates food trucks. And at least getting a few of those out there in the city. I don't think we're gonna have tons of people on Friday morning saying, I want a food truck come to my.
Do we have any idea what those parks might be? I'm curious.
I think he's
To whack and evaluate all of them, so.
I think the goal would be to at least get several different geographic locations around the city.
And it might be helpful to get citizen input on that too. I know some in the Joaquin Park area have requested that type of thing. I haven't heard requests from other parks, but it would be nice to get citizen input on, if we were to go that route, what parks citizens would like to see that option at. Any other comments about?
So with that being said, then are we going to go just say with director's approval, accepting such and so many parks?
I don't think if you go with the director's approval language, I think that Bill
We're covered.
And then Roger
Will come that and do that on his own.
Get some parks in there.
Okay.
Any concerns with that approach?
Mr. Sewell?
No, I agree with that.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
You're good? Mr. Hales?
Question number 3, turning to, this is regarding the background checks. And we kind of skipped over this. This is during the application. And so this is subsection 4 of the application section 6.32040. And the reason why we kind of skipped over it before is because I don't think there's really any legal concerns regarding the background checks, but there's been a number of policy concerns raised by the food truck industry, by some private citizens in some emails that I've seen. And so what's in here represents apparently what the food truck industry and the downtown businesses have agreed they're both okay with. But because I know there was quite a bit of discussion about this area, I just want to make sure, are there any changes desired to that section? And I gave in the marked up version that I sent early this morning a few options, such as, do we want to, some of the options I threw out as possibilities are, do you want the drivers only to be subject to the paragraph about driving infractions and substance abuse issues, or do you want them subject to everything? Do you want the felony convictions for 10 years, even though there's the other paragraphs that talk about specific crimes? And I threw out some options there about either taking that out entirely or shortening that, or leaving it as. Again, I'm not saying that there's legal problems, but there's been a number of people that have complained about it on policy grounds, and so I'm just looking for guidance whether anyone wants changes.
Any comments on that?
I'm comfortable with it, especially where you made it for the owners or the applicants and the drivers, not necessarily all the employees. And you talk about having complaints. Was that it was too intrusive, or that it wasn't intrusive enough?
Too intrusive. So for instance, so one of the complaints that I've seen is you've got this paragraph that says any felony conviction for the past 10 years, right? And then you've got another paragraph that says any conviction of any kind, whether it's a misdemeanor or a felony, that involves violence, theft, possession of weapons, possession of controlled substances, or crimes of moral turpitude. And so the question that has been raised by some, in fact, I think one came from a citizen who serves on the parole board, is that, or has some association with that. And their comment was, well, look, if the crime was 9 years ago, someone committed, a white-collar financial crime, does that really raise a public safety issue that they're now preparing tacos in a taco truck? And so their specific request was for us to take out subparagraph A that says any felony conviction over the past 10 years, and just be satisfied with all of the specific types of crimes that are listed in subparagraph C.
Regarding that, then, I can't remember there being a time element on that subsequent paragraph, was it?
C does have the same 10-year.
Okay.
Same
So it's the specific things for a 10-year period.
Yeah.
I would probably favor that.
So what about paragraph B that talks about alcohol or drug related?
Yeah,
Take
so
that out also?
that's also within 10 years. Sorry,
No,
were you
I
saying
don't
take
think
that
we're
out?
taking
So that would remain.
That would remain. They only
Just
wanted
that
they
first.
only wanted to get rid of A, and so what you would end up with is you would say anything that's driving related, anything that's substance abuse related, anything that's violence and moral turpitude, which is a term of art that would include sexual offenses and stuff. All of those things are already specifically listed. So if it's some other, non-violent, non-drug, non-driving, non-sexual offense that happened 9 years ago, does it really create a safety concern? And their argument is, their specific argument was that recidivism among offenders goes way down if you can integrate them into society. And so if you make the regulations that prohibit them from reintegrating into society so broad that they can't, then you're undermining that policy goal.
I'm in favor of taking it out.
And is the 10 years too long? I mean, does that need to be 5 years? Or what are the 10-year?
That's another open policy
I
question.
wonder if you need a special
Oh, I'd
provision
say
for former attorney generals.
we can put that in. We'll figure that out.
What is?
10 years for taxi drivers. So we've got a provision already for
Yes,
taxi
there's
drivers
something
and for beer licenses. Is it also 10 years? So the other places where we require it, we
That's-
use the same time.
That's good. I mean, that's good to know that that's got others.
Okay, so the consensus I'm hearing is take A out, but otherwise leave it the same. Okay. All right. Question number 4. Final question. And this one is in 6.32.090, which is, again, I just want to make sure that the council is on board with what the business group has proposed, which is deletion of the paragraph that prohibits them from operating on multiple food trucks from operating on the same street. Is there any opposition to deleting that, or any desire to keep it in?
Comment, Mr. Hales?
I'm not opposed.
Mr.
Just a
Witherton?
question, I'm not really opposed. Are they subject, we're not doing a 100-foot radius for them necessarily.
For each other.
For each other?
No, that's not included right now. So, and that's, I think, why one of the reasons why it was kind of two separate issues, right? So we've got a 100-foot radius from the restaurants. You can't operate on the same side of the street, on the same block face, and so taking that out would allow them to again, there's all kinds of parking restrictions and stuff, but where they could legally park on the same side of the street, they could now operate.
In Mr. Faulkner's email, he mentioned that when they're closer together, they do 100% or 400% better. I mean, that's how they do well, is when they can be together. So
And I
Makes
think the
sense
argument was, we're kind of trying to do the same thing with two different plazas. Now we've got the 100-foot radius. You're not going to have two trucks parking in front of your restaurant, taking all your parking places. So I think it's covered it with the 100-foot radius anyway. So.
and citywide, I guess consideration too, other than the downtown, does that create a problem citywide?
So the last, I think I got my answer on that one, and just the last two more as comments in case this raises concerns. I think based on the discussion before in subparagraph A about the use of power and water, I will add the phrase, or the owner's authorized designee, to allow written consent to come from that person. And then again, as an informational thing, here's another one where the administration may want to throw me under the food truck, but so to speak. But in the special events section, there was a sentence that said, if you get a special event permit, the entire ordinance no longer applies unless the permit or an administrative policy says that parts of it apply. My personal reading of that was way too broad, and I changed it to say the ordinance applies except to the degree that the permit or the administrative policy says that it doesn't apply. My view was that was a safer way of carving out the exceptions than having the entire thing be an exception and having to remember what to include. So that was how I changed that. Okay, so I will make those changes, and unless there's any other comments or changes required, I think we can get that done.
Okay. Any other comments? All right, thank you. We will move to the next item on the agenda, which is an update on a quality audit of Provo City Code by our newest hire, our council office intern, Dan Quick.
Awesome.
Oh, you're going to do it. Okay. Matt Taylor.
Thank you, members of the council. Just hopefully I can be brief. However, this item being posted elicited a little bit more discussion than I anticipated, so I think it'd be helpful to give you a little bit more background. Why this is on the agenda, where we're at, what the intention here is. It was divided into two parts. One was just more of an update, quality audit. Secondly, sort of a tool to help us proceed in advancing additional improvements in the quality of city code. As the basis for this action, or this report, actually I would say, Provo City Code 2.5013, which is the Executive Director's responsibilities, which are outlined fairly thoroughly. So they may include, but are not limited to, and one of those specifically advises to the supervision or to supervise and have responsibility for the maintenance and publication of the Provo City Code. Now, narrowly, and what's traditionally been the practice, that has this has included the incorporation of adopted ordinances of the council into the city code, formatting, and printing and publication of the city code. Both Brian Jones and former council attorney Neil Lindbergh have both interpreted that provision a little more broadly than just those minimum duties, and I tend to agree that certainly could be an outcome. Is that maintenance of the city code could also be viewed as correction of that code, so maintenance and correction of the code, which of out-of-date references to state and federal statute, review against state and federal statute and case law. So we got two different issues there. One is oftentimes the state legislature will revise their own codes, which may lead to a renumbering or reformatting of the code. And at any time that we as a city has referenced that code, it could be out of date. In fact, actually, sometimes it's out of date in multiple ways. One is formatting and two is reference. A good example of that might be state code says, well, our code might refer to, say, Title 10, Chapter 6, Section 301 of the state code, and that's been changed, and maybe now it's Title 10, Section 11, or sorry, Chapter 11, Section 2. So I'm just throwing out numbers. But that's the idea, that these references can get out of date. Another issue I refer to is out of date with current statutes. So not just a numbering, but maybe the statute has changed in some way that now puts the city's provisions in conflict with the state or federal statute, which presents us problems, and Mr. Jones will probably speak a little bit more articulately about those problems. especially when we rely on out-of-date or inconsistent ordinances for the basis of one of our decisions. And so that's problematic. Also, there's also case law as developed by the state and also federal courts that could also put our current statutes out of harmony. I think the most recent example of that would be the assisted living center provisions that we dealt with earlier this year, where case law has advanced to a point that now rendered our ordinance obsolete and actually at odds with where the courts have determined the correct interpretation of federal statute should be. And so I think that's one way to also interpret maintenance of the code is incumbent upon me to not make those changes, but review and look for those inconsistencies. Some additional worthy goals that we have never pursued. Well, let me say, those last two things I mentioned haven't been pursued either, as far as I understand. I do not believe my predecessors have the resources to deal with that. I can say when we comprehensively looked at the ordinance since probably 1977. So,
Long time.
yes, a long time. A couple additional worthy goals in maintaining the code could also include reviewing for consistency with current council policy. So we may have ordinances on the book which do not reflect the policy or will of the current council. And I don't have a good example off the top of my head. That's more of a theoretical question. Our review process could identify codes that are inconsistent with where you want to go as a city. In some ways, I've also referred to this maybe just as a bureaucratic audit of city legislation. Mr. Jones referred to the Economist article that sometimes additional legislation can create economic impacts. So it's not just economic impacts, but impacts to citizens and getting their daily business done. So is there some room in this review process for what I've dubbed as a bureaucratic audit of city code? So this comes to resources. Why hasn't this been done in 40 years, close to 40 years? On a consistent basis, I believe, one, it's just been a matter of resources and time. There's always bigger fish to fry or other more immediate concerns and needs. And so it's often put on the back burner. We have restructured our internal office affairs in a way that frees up a few resources. One, we have consolidated some positions. We used to have 2 executive office positions. One of those full-time positions has been eliminated, and even the part-time position I turned into is now, those resources have been funneled for communications and neighborhood program, which we're in the process of trying to fill that position. But, so we have some additional resources. We also have a part-time intern, Daniel Quick. We've introduced him to you before, but he has started phase 1 of the process. Has actually completed phase 1. I'll tell you what that is. But Dan, he just a little bit more. He is currently working on his MPA, Master's of Public Administration, with a joint degree, a JD, Juris Doctorate degree. And so he has basic legal research training and ability to use LexisNexis and other research articles. And part of his assignment, we work very closely with Brian Jones and also the legal departments too in his work. So maintenance is, again, I'm going to approach this from the realm of what's the reasonable interpretation from my standpoint of city code. Certainly the council, if they believe that my interpretation is not reasonable, you can instruct me or put limitations on what I've interpreted as reasonable. But phase 1 was a quality audit of city code, and that's what we intend to report on just briefly. Phase 1 of this maintenance of city code, we became aware of a few ordinances that had incorrectly made, the final version had not made its way into the published version. So instead of that, maybe we had a draft ordinance, such as we're discussing today, some changes were made before or at the time of the decision by the council. Those final changes didn't make their way in. Our secretary that was over publication had made some oversights and actually had the draft ordinance published. So becoming aware of those, we weren't confident to the severity or extent that these type of mistakes were made. And so that was Dan's first assignment, was to go over the last 3 years and do a quality check audit to ensure that every ordinance passed by the council was that actual final ordinance. And I think Dan discovered about a dozen ordinances of that's some substantial problems, and in consultation with Brian Jones and working with our third-party vendor, those have been corrected. Okay, so phase 1's pretty much complete. Phase
Matt, can I ask you a
Yes,
question
sir.
about that? And then, give me okay for
Go ahead,
just
yeah.
when you say that the changes, the final version was actually, how do we know that that was a final version?
So we
Compared to
established an internal process for determining what the final version was, and Dan corrects me because he did it over and over and over again. But the process that we determined was to go through, actually pull up what was published, essentially listen to every meeting, at least the last 15 minutes of every meeting, to find out if there was some type of motion which changed the draft ordinance. If there was, then we maybe even go back further in the recordings to verify what was the intent and content that the council approved as part of that change. And then we would identify either whether maybe we had that change and just didn't get to the right place, or maybe we had to draft that change. But in every case, we verified the public record and the actual motion and approval of the council. Does that make sense? So the final that was corrected, I don't believe there's any need to come back to the council, because what we're doing is basically correcting an administrative oversight where the wrong thing got put in, and we're just putting in the right thing.
It's essentially the Lakeview Fields situation,
Yes.
right?
That's
I
what
mean, an ordinance comes in at the beginning of the meeting, it gets changed during the meeting, and the minutes are absolutely clear that it got changed, but the recorder doesn't get handed a piece of paper with the change, and so she puts the document that was there at the beginning of the meeting into the system. And so what Dan's done is he's looked at the minutes and listened to the audio recordings to make sure that the document at the end reflects the changes made during the meeting.
And how many of those did you find in the last?
3 years, about 12. So not a huge systemic problem, just again, we wanted to have complete confidence that everything in the code book was accurate reflection of what you actually approved. Okay. And again, we have multiple sets of eyes on that process between Dan and Brian and myself.
And do other council members have a desire to see those 12 ordinances, to see what corrections were made? We want that to come before the council?
That's fine. We can produce that report and distribute that to you.
Yeah, if you could distribute that report, that would be great.
And we have built in additional review processes at the end of our review cycle, post-council meeting, post-approval, post-council approval, to ensure that we're getting it correct. So we have review by our policy analysts, and also reviewed by Brian Jones. It's another step in there, Louise. We also have the council chair actually looking at every ordinance before he attaches his signature to it, as well as the mayor, which wasn't happening before either. So they would just sign the cover sheet and move on. So we actually have that ordinance brought up in their face saying you must approve this. So we have about 4 sets of additional eyes on it that we didn't have. So hopefully this won't be a problem again. Any other questions on that phase 1 part of this project?
Any other questions or comments?
Okay. Phase 2 is, again, trying to be more proactive, doing our bare minimum as far as maintenance, and how can we take our level of service to the next level. And that, and my approach to that was to go after low-hanging fruit. Okay, and the low-hanging fruit, again, as I mentioned, in my mind, would have been outdated references to state code. And these would have been clear cut. The number was this, the number is now this. The number was X, the number is now Y. And that's what we're going through right now with Dan. We'll also be having Brian take a look at each of those to see that he concurs that these are the same provisions, and or at least the same provisions, even if those provisions were amended, and that we're referencing out to the right area of state code. Phase 3 would then be start looking at technical legal consistency with state and federal statute or case law, similar to what we did with assisted living. Now, okay, let's look at these actual, what's actually on the books on the state or federal level. Are we consistent or are we at odds with those requirements? And that's an additional level of depth and review that again, I think Dan will have some interest in getting started and as part of his internship, but also we'll have Brian and the rest of the legal team helping inform of the needs and propose corrections. Just like the assisted living, each of those would come to you for review and approval, just like any other ordinance, even if it's necessary for you to review and approve it, so we're not at risk of some type of liability. Phase 4 would be, okay, and again, this is sort of my approach. We could always shift priority, maybe, if the council wanted to, is to look at how does the code encourage or detract from your stated policies as a council. These could be policies of the general plan, or master plans of Vision 2030, and tax statements, and see if our current ordinances are supportive or, again, taking us further away from those goals. I think we're probably several years out. I mean, this is a probably 3 to 5 year project or more. I mean, this is not an easy, small project. So this would be having somebody in this part-time internship capacity working on this consistently for quite a while. The amendment process, and again, this might bring us to the next item on the agenda, was a concept to save some administrative work and processing for these very low-hanging fruit of technical, unsubstantive cleanup items. So again, where it's determined that truly is just a number change in the code, or we have a misspelled word. Not a different word, that would be substantive. So I've heard some concern that we might, as staff, change the word from may to shall. That would be hugely substantive, and we would never do that because that would change the entire meaning and intent of the City Council ordinance. However, if it was insure versus ensure, I-N-S-U-H-S-U-R-E versus E-N-S-U-R-E, which clearly have two different meanings and was very easily determined. That wasn't the intent to insure an automobile, but ensure that something happens. That may be a typographical cleanup. However, in that might bring some ambiguity, and we definitely proceed with cautious. I think the original intent was more like if it was just a very obvious misspelling. We'd be able to clean that up without waiting for the annual codification process. Now, an alternative is if the council or any member of the council is uncomfortable with granting that type of cleanup authority, we can certainly come to you. I think my proposal would be just come to you with a general omnibus cleanup package at the end of each year prior to adoption of the city code. Either way, I think the intent of me putting this on the agenda has been fulfilled. I want to give you a general overview of this maintenance of the city code problem and what we're doing to try and advance that forward. Also, I value your feedback. If you think our approach is a reasonable interpretation of the code, if you think that we're biting off more than what was intended by the council all those years that adopted that provision, we can certainly scale back what we're defining as maintenance, and or we can proceed as we've been moving forward. And then in reference to the proposed ordinance, again, if there's any concern, I just propose tabling it. We'll come to you with a general omnibus cleanup every year.
Mr. Hales,
I'm comfortable with that. Urge you to move forward.
you're comfortable with,
I'm comfortable with the idea that he cleans things up, brings us a report at the end of the year. I'm pleased with that idea.
Mr. Sewell?
I like the project and the goals. I'm a little more comfortable with the omnibus approach that you mentioned, where you would bring it to us and then the council could approve it.
And Steve, maybe it'd be helpful if I clarify. So the ordinance that I was talking about would have allowed us to immediately make changes to problems that we identified. And again, these were just code references or very minor typos. And that allows us to update the code within a matter of a few days or a week with our vendor.
But that's, I mean, you've talked about a bunch of different, you've talked about your 4 phases. The proposal was that authority to immediately change was only to do with
yes,
incorrect references.
those 2 things.
It was
Yes.
only those 2 things.
And which is different than any type of other change to the code. Now, that would allow an ordinance that gave us that ability would allow us to make those right away so that they're reflected as soon as possible in city code.
Mr.
The
Sewell?
only other approach would mean that we would identify these, and then we may have to wait up to a year to actually reflect the change in our published online code. So I just want to make sure that was. I want to make sure I know which one you're comfortable with.
I'm comfortable with making the typo corrections immediately, and anything that seems more substantial than that, preparing it, bringing it to us at the end of the year.
And that's what.
Typo and code. No.
Well, just references, typo and references. And that was always our intent with this proposal.
So my concern with that is I think it's possible for even an experienced, reasonable person to make a change that seems unsubstantive, but might end up having a legal effect. And so that's one concern. Another is I think it would be useful for the council, or at least whoever was interested on the council, to look at these before they're approved. It might trigger some, oh, well, I didn't know that was an error, this ordinance was an error, and that there may be some educational value there of seeing it before it's changed. That might prompt some additional action to remedy the problem. And I think we have a very experienced, competent team here, but I go back to what the mayor was saying earlier when we were talking about a different approval process. You shouldn't base it on your confidence of the people that are currently in the seats. And I'd feel more comfortable if it was sort of like with the minutes where and I don't think it has to be just once a year, you could bring it to us whenever you had a good sized list, where whoever was interested could look through it. It was published up on the site for a few days before the meeting. We have citizens that are very interested in these things that would pour through there, and we might catch something that might slip through otherwise. So that would be my suggestion.
I don't have a strong preference either way. Again, my intent was to speed up the process for these minor issues, but if I'm happy tabling this proposal if that makes some council members feel better about the process.
Mr. Van Buren?
And so you're talking about even the little typo changes to wait and goes through this process?
Well, I would think so, just because, and maybe Mr. Jones could comment on this, but I think it's possible for a comma or a typo to actually have an unintended legal significance that might not be obvious when you're reading through it, but somebody else who maybe is looking at it from a different position might.
Right. It's certainly possible. So commas, for example. Now, my personal opinion would probably be that a comma wouldn't be a typo, and I think Matt is referring to, if it's supposed to be shall, but the code says SHLL, right? But I guess that raises the question, maybe it was supposed to be shall.
Right, things like
and
that, yeah.
And they assume it's supposed to be shall. I mean, it's possible you could include in the authorization some definitional standards to try to avoid that, but I think you're right. There's probably no way to absolutely eliminate the possibility that staff could make a mistake.
Now, in the draft that we put forward, it didn't make me or one of my staff the sole decision maker. We included Mr. Jones or the council attorney, whoever that may be, as a second pair of eyes to authorize that change. Certainly could be the council chair, if that would ensure confidence. But again, I understand Mr. Sewell's point, and we can certainly do it in the way that you prefer.
Yeah, I mean, as you say that thing occurs to me, and this, I guess, comes from my law firm experience of how we handle changes in the federal code. You could create a committee that reviews, and as long as the committee approves, they go into effect. Again, I think Matt has stated the intent is to do whatever you want to do as far as getting the code where it ought to be with as little burden on you as possible.
Mr. Winterton?
Thanks. I just think we clean up the easy mistakes. This seems to be like something we can clean up easy mistakes, and then if we just have a substantial code change because of something that was changed, sometime, some way, someday, we're gonna have somebody that say, well, I want to do something, and it says so in the code. And if we decide we don't want to at that time because of the change that was made, if we're just trying to clean up little teeny things, and we do accidentally make something big, we're going to make mistakes all the time anyway. It's going to happen no matter what we do. And I just feel let's just clean up the easy ones, and then if there's bigger problems, let's deal with those as they come up.
And another option, again, I'm just kind of brainstorming because this was, I really haven't talked to Matt very much about this, but if the concern is is an awareness issue, staff could generate a report every week of the changes made that week, and as soon as somebody caught one that they thought shouldn't have been made, we could immediately reverse it or bring
Yeah, we're certainly open to that. Again, I think the interest was to expedite these minor things in the most efficient way possible. We certainly want to do it in a way that's comfortable, whatever that mechanism may be. I probably failed to mention that ultimately you'd be approving any change anyways, because what we put forward in language was we would give you a report of anything we did at the time of the codification, and that you would actually, we would make in some ways a temporary change to what's been published, but you would in some ways, what's the word I'm looking for, ratify, thank you, ratify that at the time of codification. So it's not really, it's giving us some authority. The proposal was give us some temporary authority to change what's published. You would still have an actual formal motion before your codification to accept that and officially adopt it.
Is there a problem with doing it on a more frequent basis rather than just at the end of the year? It would be easier for me to have small bits coming in to be able to look at rather than at the end of the year have a whole year's worth of changes to look through. So for me personally, it would be better for me to have it at each council meeting.
Quarterly makes sense. Quarterly, I fear that if we did it every month, it would start becoming one of these thorns in your side, which is one of the things we're trying to avoid is additional work that's taking you away from substantive issues.
I think the city code is substantive. Those are our laws. I mean, I think if there were an issue and I'm ultimately responsible for whatever happened, that's me personally. I want to see it before it's put in writing. But that's my own personal
I'm open
preference.
to any process that you're comfortable with, and so that's certainly reasonable to me, and we'd be happy to do that if that's the direction the council would like to go. Again, I think my role is to reasonably interpret what your will is, and if at any time I'm not reasonably interpreting it, you can certainly give me additional guidelines that help me interpret where you want to go, and so this is the forum to do that.
Mr. Sewell?
So I have a question about this concept of a temporary change. I mean, if this ordinance were passed and empowered changes to be made immediately, then that becomes law, right? I mean, I don't understand.
Right, and I think that's why he used the word ratification. I mean, they are, if council staff has the authority by ordinance to make immediate changes, then we would certainly, if confronted with an issue, argue that the code was the code as soon as the change was made. The issue is just that I think what Matt's referring to is just that during the annual, or if we decide to increase, or if you decided to do it more often, the recodification process of those reports just ratifies the action by the council. But I think you're right, and I understand what you're saying.
Based on this feedback, I propose not making any immediate changes to anything we identify, just coming to you with a quarterly update that you could approve.
If that becomes burdensome, I guess you can always say.
You can always give new direction.
Again, I think that's fine with me. I'm sorry to even spend so much time on this. If it's a typo, if it's something that's incorrect, it's obvious, I wish we could just do it, make the change, and look at a list later if we're curious. But I don't have any problem.
Well, it's more important to me that everyone trusts the processes that we build, so I'd rather move to that direction.
I think for me, it's just that, as we already know, some things are subject to human error. And so I think the more, like you said, the more eyes we have on something, the less that opportunity for error is going to occur. And so I don't think it's, for me, I would be happy to look at it as often as possible, to be able to just be that other set of eyes, because ultimately it's the council responsibility. But
No, I think that advances my goals, and I think no motion is needed at this point unless you'd like to advance something forward. I'll just take the feedback I received, and we'll be back to you as soon as we have something that we can clean up. So, and I know Dan's already identified some things, so we'll continue moving down that process.
is any other comment?
Just one, it kind of concerns me that we found 12 in the last 3 years of those Lakeview, because I don't want to have to go through Lakeview again and deal with that issue.
I don't think any of them were of the significance of Lakeview. None of them were zoning issues, and none of them, I'd have to go back and look at the list again, but I went through the list with Dan, and none of them were ones, first of all, they were all ones where I kind of remembered how the meeting went, and it wasn't surprising to me that happened, because they were, well, I think the other thing that I can't remember if Matt mentioned this, but the other thing that I think is going to help fix this problem is the policy that the council has adopted, that we're not going to vote on something until you actually have the written form in front of you.
That's one of the other safeguards we've implemented.
And that's,
we were doing that a lot.
So then we actually see the ordinance.
And these were all in those situations, but as I looked at them, there were none of them that I went, oh, I think this is going to cause a problem. They were all ones where I was like, well, I think everybody who was affected by that ordinance knew exactly what happened, and it shouldn't be a problem.
So thank you for that, Brian, because that is one of the other processes we've been encouraging to happen, so we don't have this again.
And one other process is on our summary of action. We've been putting in any other recommendations that are made during the council meeting, so we catch those and we're all aware of them. And we just have put in so many things.
And those are the things that we get those every week.
Right.
So it's still our responsibility to open that email. This is a summary of the council meeting that we had, so I appreciate that.
So many more items.
And I admit, sort of selfishly, that we stopped at 3 to 4 years back, because that's when my tenure started. So I just want to make sure that any problems weren't of my poor oversight. So prior to that, certainly I couldn't weigh in. Like Lakeview Fields was previous to my administration here. So we can certainly go back and do that same process all the way back, but I think that'd be very burdensome.
Mr. Jones.
Would this be an okay time to make my really quick comment about motions that we talked about in leadership last week?
Yes.
I think it's kind of relevant to that. We had an issue come up last week, and in a perfect world, this would never happen. But we had an issue come up in our last meeting where the agenda and the short title of the actual ordinance didn't completely match. They had different dates in them, and we've gotten into this habit of making motions by saying, I move to, and then reading the entire short title of the item off of the agenda. In this particular case, it turned out okay because that was done, but then the next person said, but then the next person made a motion to do and used some different words that I think adequately incorporated the change. But in talking with Janine about it and Matt and leadership, I would recommend that just to prevent that from happening, instead of saying I move to and then reading the entire short, well, let me back up. The short title gets read in at the beginning of the discussion of the item. So it's already on the record, and the purpose of having it there is to define what the discussion is about. It's not actually important for that short title to be repeated as far as what the motion is for. So I would advocate instead simply making it a little bit simpler and just saying, I move to pass the ordinance as written, or to pass the resolution as presently constituted. And then, one, it's a time saver because you don't have to read that whole thing through. And then two, because we have this rule in place that we're only going to vote on stuff that we have in writing in front of us, it's clear that what's being voted on is what's in writing in front of us instead of what the agenda might say if there's a difference between the two. Any questions about that? Okay, I thought this would be time to bring that up.
And I just want to thank you for working on this, updating the code. It's something that I feel strongly about, and I appreciate your efforts on this, and hopefully we can find a way that works for you, works for the council to be able to get.
One thing I didn't mention is phase 2, which is this minor stuff, and phase 3, which is more of the substantive. We got a problem with case law or statute. Is semi-concurrent. I've asked Dan just to help him survive the monotony of the first task, to also start working with legal and other departments on identifying places that we know are inconsistent. We have one that it's not actually case law, it's probably inconsistent with city policy that related to the fire code that we may be bringing you sooner than later. So we are making some progress in the more substantial stuff.
All right, thank you. I'm going to need to move on. Thank you, Mr. Quick. And Mr. Maxfield. It's here to discuss the text amendment to the Provo City Code. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, to reduce or eliminate the minimum acreage. Is that?
That's correct. This item was request of Mr. Nate Chappell, and there's a lot of discussion as to whether it applies to certain property or not, but as we look at it, we apply it to the whole city in different aspects. And as we looked at it, the basic ordinance right now is no subdivision shall be less than 3 acres unless the Planning Commission determines that a proposed subdivision of lesser size is infill to the development of an overall area, and such property cannot reasonably be combined with adjacent properties and comply to the requirements of this title. So in essence, what was happening, we were having people that came in with less than 3 acres and having to say, can you find this as an infill development, yes or no? And so it became somewhat subjective as to what was next to what was going on. As we evaluated it, we looked at the planning aspect of it, and with engineering, what we're really looking at is great connectivity between adjoining areas. And what we found is 10-acre plus subdivision had the same problem. It had nothing to do with size. It rather had what is the land around the site like. And so what we proposed instead was changing it to really address more of the connectivity. And it's almost a complete change of that ordinance. It says instead of minimum acreage requirements, calling it connectivity to adjacent areas, and then having an A and B part, with A saying when reasonably feasible, all proposed subdivisions shall be designed to be integrated through street and or pedestrian connections to adjacent subdivisions or to undeveloped lands having a similar land use designation on the general plan. And reasonably feasible would be where it wouldn't be where you have terrain differences or something else. It would just be a little hard to connect, and it'd be reasonable not to require a connection in that case. B is proposed subdivisions adjacent to vacant lands of a similar land use on the general plan shall submit with the preliminary plan application a viable conceptual development layout to include those undeveloped areas up to a distance of 600 feet from the proposed subdivision. The distance is somewhat arbitrary. We try to look at what's a sufficient distance to really look at a couple of lots deep into a project without going too far, such as maybe down in the southwest area of town where if we didn't limit it, it'd go all the way out to a lake, a mile away or something like that. We didn't think that was necessarily reasonable. But the basic intent is that when we look at these areas, we find, is there a way to connect the adjoining areas for the future? We would have that on file where the adjacent property owner, even though they may not have participated in that plan, it gives them a layout that they can either follow or give us something better. And so it always has something on record that we know that area can connect, how it can connect, how we stub the streets to the area, how we provide for that future development. And so staff is proposing with those amendments, supporting the application. Any questions?
Mr. Sewell?
I was just curious, this was originally requested by a developer on the west side that had a problem with a piece of ground there, right? And I was just wondering how, but your proposal didn't exactly match what he asked for, right?
Right.
And so I was just curious about how your proposal affects that.
That particular piece, it affects in a couple of ways. I guess even historically, you would have gone back to the larger subdivision of the east. You would have addressed it at that time rather than leave the little pieces out, which the current language would, because they're bigger than 3 acres, they never would have had to look at it. His particular piece is a problem for connectivity. It will be forever. Not changing anything will never solve that. But everyone forgets that the 2 pieces to his north are in the same situation. If they came in to develop, it'd be hard to argue that somehow they're infill, but he's not. And so it really, I think, creates more of an equal footing. There is one that everybody's concerned about on the Geneva Road. There are some other pieces. We looked at actually about 10 different pieces through the city. It would allow him to proceed with the rezoning and a subdivision request if this were approved.
Any other questions, Mr. Winterton?
How are you comfortable with looking at an overall picture when you're only dealing with just such a small piece? Is it hard to put things together like that? Is that in the past to get the connectivity in when you're dealing with such a small piece compared to 15 or 20 acres maybe?
Yes, we don't have as many options. Like in the one piece that we can refer to that one on Geneva Road, there was really only one option to connect to the joint properties. However, if you step back and look at it again historically, the real problem I think occurred because you didn't have an extension of stub streets down from the east side into that property. You're still creating the same number of drives out on Geneva Road you would one way or the other, whether you have flag lots from the properties or if you did a road. What we tried to look at were, again, situations that apply to small properties. How do we look at the ones that are left? But as we got in the larger subdivisions, to ensure that they also stuck to the right areas. We have one kind of in process now down in the southwest area of town that, again, is more than 3 acres, and we would normally just take it up to a point and say, well, whatever happens, they're forced to do that now. But this would require us really to look at how does that then connect to the rest of the area, really creating more of a community feel than just, adjacent subdivisions that have no connectivity in any way. Does that answer your question?
I think so. I just see it
in a roundabout way.
Yeah, it's going to be a challenge for just to look at the overall pictures and dealing with smaller pieces.
Yeah.
But that may force us to actually do that and say, okay, then this is where we've got to get the connectivity to go.
Right. Some will be easy. Some you look at, there's only one solution. Other ones will be a little more complicated because it involves what-if scenarios.
Mr. Van Buren?
I just think supporting this too gives you sometimes on these small pieces, individual property owners can be held bound by whatever feelings there might be with other property owners. And so they have no options. And I think we can't put all the burden on a property owner to go make amends with all surrounding property owners and work it, because sometimes you can't. And
Yeah, there's no way to force them to go buy another property.
right, and so I think we've got to have a way to still go forward sometimes. So I think this kind of helps that.
All right, thank you. So this requires a motion? Or is
No,
this
this one
on
is, this
the,
is notice for the 5th.
For the 5th. All right, the next item is a discussion on a text amendment to Provo City Code 14.23.070 to allow street side yard setbacks to be extended beyond the 6-foot maximum when a property is located within 100 feet of a railroad track upon review by Design Review Committee. This is Josh Yost.
Thank you. This is really a small amendment to the interim transit-oriented development district to allow flexibility in building setbacks. Right now, we have a maximum setback on any property line frontage, so a street front yard, a street side yard of 6 feet. In the downtown 1 and the downtown 2 zones, we have a provision that allows us to increase those setbacks to allow for courtyards, plazas, passages, some other types of different uses of the front setback of a building. And the project that's going across the street here that's being done in cooperation with the redevelopment agency, there's a plaza off of 300 West that wouldn't be allowed in the ITOD in the current zone. And this basically will take the language from the downtown 1 and downtown 2 zones, which has served us well for a few years we've had those zones, and basically transplant it into the ITOD zone. And if you look at the report of action from the Planning Commission that you have in your packet, you can see the Planning Commission recommended text amendment actually duplicates, different than the specific language proposed by the applicant, that they actually wrote it a little more narrowly, thinking that it may be more palatable, but we really felt that it made sense to not just apply it to areas adjacent to the rail and the ITOD, but to give that flexibility throughout the district, as it allows us to do a number of different things in terms of urban design to create pocket parks, pedestrian spaces, plazas, dining patios, mid-block walkways that wouldn't be allowed under the really strict current zone we have. So that language is included in the Planning Commission recommended text amendment, and the extension of these setbacks beyond the maximum 6-foot setback we have right now in the zone requires the review and positive determination of the Design Review Committee based on 5 criteria that are listed there as well. So we are happy that this has been able to move forward quickly, and we feel it would be a positive to the continuing development of the area that's actually moving faster than we thought it would. By next year, we'll have, including the development we've seen right now, close to 130 new units of residential directly surrounding the commuter rail station. So we're positive that the momentum will continue, and this will help us.
Thank you. Are there questions, Mr. Yost?
Mr. Question, but I do want to say that I think that that particular zone has been a great thing and would be wonderful to apply it to this new TOD area. I'm totally in favor.
Okay. Thank you. Administration, have anything? All right, thank you, Mr. Yost. So we don't have anything for closed meeting. And does administration have any items?
To share a couple of quick thoughts. I've had 3 pretty significant things happen on Center Street that just really impressed me that you may or may not have seen. I want to share with you. You've seen Pioneer Book. If you haven't, just working down to walk down there between our break. It's a brand new facade that will just knock your socks off. Really fun, clever. And we'll add a lot to downtown.
So I saw it going in. I think they're painting the exterior. They need to get approval to do something like that in the historic zone.
So Josh, do you want
Did they
to
seek
comment on
it?
that?
That's actually outside of the downtown historic district, which extends only to 300 east. So it did not require review, 300 west, so it did not require review from the Land Commission.
They were telling us this morning that building surprised me. The building was built in the 70s. And then we walked inside, and we took the whole office down there just to walk inside. And it's really very, very impressive. He's invested a lot of money into that building. So if you give me a minute, walk past that building. And then, so Ted Heinzelman and I sometimes will arm wrestle about what's best for downtown. But and I've now learned there's Schofield, excuse me. Yes. I've learned that there's a term for what they did. They yarn bombed the sycamore tree in the median there, and I didn't notice this, but I looked closer, and the yarn bombed the light post and a couple other trees right there. Anyway, I thought that was pretty fun and eclectic and part of our downtown.
So they have a sweater despite the fact that it's 100 degrees outside.
And then we've actually had 2 new stores open that are remarkably similar. I haven't been into What's Hot until today. But What's Hot is there in the old New Skins building. They ran a store on a place next to it, but they've really upgraded and used this as a stepping stone. Nice finishes that New Skin had inside that building. Looks really nice. And then High Stepping Shoes is in the Carol Walker and her sister's building. It used to be the yard material.
Fabric.
Thank you, fabric mill, right there. And both of those was hot, and High Stepping Shoes were really targeted at some demographic that's going to be downtown.
I was curious about that. What's Hot? Is that a New Skin? That's not a New Skin.
It's not connected at all.
Is the building still owned by New Skin?
Actually, that building never was.
Oh, it was leased.
Yes, it's leased. The owner there actually put in quite a few upgrades and seating and things as New Skin moved out. And it's very well done. It's a beautiful building from the outside. Very well done on the inside. Get a minute, walk in there and say hi to them.
I believe it's one of the oldest buildings.
Is it?
I think it's 1870s. Sort of.
Yeah. Kind of fun to see the continual investment in downtown. To see some of these fun new stores open up. I think that's all we've got.
All right, thank you, Mayor Curtis. Are there any other comments? If not, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Mr. Hales, Mr. Sewell, second. Thank you.
You want to chat?
Yeah.
Vote.
Oh, vote. Oh, I'm sorry. They were all nodding yes. I guess we still need to. Thank you. The vote is unanimous.
Thank you.